V. Hi, everyone. Welcome.
Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, NLP for coaches and leaders and trainers. And we're very happy that you're here with us today and that you printed out your guide. And this is a working webinar. You're going to get to learn a lot about NLP and to practice, so that you can walk away with some more competencies in terms of communication and communicating effectively. And notice your feelings as you go through this course, because a large part of the work we do at Ideal Coaching has to do with mindfulness. You're aware of ontology and also ecology, which is what attracted me to NLP many, many years ago. And I became a master practitioner in NLP. Even though I don't practice it the way some people do, but I utilize so much of what I've used in NLP in all of my work, especially coaching. And so be here today and to clear with your intention about what you want to create. And we will go over in this webinar, this course, because it is a course, how to establish well-formed outcomes so that you can, with more, I'm getting feedback, so that you can, with more effectiveness, not only accomplish what you want to accomplish, but work with the people in your life, whether they're clients, friends, or families, to accomplish what they want to accomplish. So this is a learning endeavor. Turn off your cell phones and your TV. Have plenty of fresh water. Have your pen and your paper. And be open to learn and explore about NLP and the learnings that you're about to receive. And also, we will keep speaking with you also throughout these next 3 or 4 weeks about coaching. For those of you who are already coaches, welcome. For those of you who want to learn more about coaching, you will have an opportunity for that as well, and in Ideal Coaching especially. So thank you for being here. And now I want to introduce you to Xavier. And we've known each other for a while, but he's a master NLP practitioner, trainer, travels all over the world teaching NLP. So welcome.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm so happy to be here, and I want to start sharing some slides with you as we chat. Let's see. So I wanted to just give a quick overview of the program as we go along. As you know, this is a 4-part NLP webinar sessions, and so we'll start this week, and it'll happen every Wednesday, September 13th, 20th, 27th, and October 4th. And there'll actually be 4 of us who are going to be doing the training. Oops. And let's actually do a little quick introductions. So, you know Betty, just introduce yourself. My name is Xavier Lee, and I am a master trainer in NLP. What I mostly do is actually teach mindfulness and leadership for corporations. So my background is in strategic planning and marketing for large Fortune 100 companies. But about 10 years ago, I actually switched to doing the stuff that I love, which is actually coaching and sharing what I love about communications and so forth. We'll also be joined by Joyce Christie and Nadine Cooper. And we'll be taking turns sort of leading the different webinar sessions. So for session 1, it'll be mostly Betty and I. And for session 2, it'll be Joyce and Nadine. And for session 3, it'll be Joyce and myself. And for session 4, Betty, Joyce, and Nadine will be leading the sessions. So let me actually give you a very quick story about how I got into NLP. So as I said, I used to be in the corporate world, and then kind of interesting thing happened. You know, like a lot of people, I went through a big transition where from being a sort of a superstar in the corporate world, where I was kind of slated to be the next country manager. I had gotten like 4 promotions in 3 years, but then 2 of my coworkers literally died from stress. And my CEO came up to me and said, "Hey, listen, I'd like to promote you for the 5th time." And I thought, wow, is this what I really want? And I decided actually it wasn't, and I left the corporate world. And actually not too soon after that, there was a big kind of trauma to my, I guess, sense of identity. And I ended up actually going through a divorce, and it got to a point where I was actually really lost, and I was trying to figure out what is it that I wanted to do with my life. And that's when I actually discovered both NLP and mindfulness. And it actually led me to some possibilities that I just never knew existed, where I actually, since learning this stuff, it was kind of getting a sort of an owner's manual to my own mind and to my own emotions. So all of a sudden I was able to really kind of accelerate my life, where I've been now teaching at 12 different countries. That's me and Betty in that picture right there.
And Kyla.
And Kyla down in LA. And so yeah, I've been really enjoying this road, and I wanted to share the stuff that I've been learning, as well as Betty and Nadine and Joyce. So what are we going to be doing for the next basically 4 weeks? The session 1, this session is really going to be focused on the foundations of neuro-linguistic programming. We'll be covering what is NLP, what is the coaching model for NLP, and we'll be talking about one of the most important part of NLP, which I think is the presuppositions, and then the well-formed outcome. And we'll be talking about much more in depth about that in a minute. Session 2, the theme is art of connecting. So one of the most important usefulness of NLP is that it makes you excellent in communications, both communication with yourself and with others. So we will be upping the quality of your communication skills by, once again, going over presupposition, how to create rapport, and also create a state of excellence for yourself. In session 3, we're going to be now taking some of these tools to expand the possibility of you as a coach, as a leader, and as a trainer. So we'll continue to explore some more presuppositions. We'll learn a little bit more about advanced rapport skills. We'll cover what I call meta programs, which are basically a way of identifying how people filter the world and how we get motivated. And then we will cover one of the most basic, but one of the actually tools that are commonly used by geniuses. And then on the session 4, our final session, we'll be talking about the last of our presuppositions that we'll be covering, a little bit more about how to use our languages more effectively. And also notice when people are using the language to influence us. Then we'll be going through what are called neurological levels, which is a way of changing behavior, but not just from an outside surface level, but from a deep level of our core identity and our values and beliefs. And then we want to really round up by talking about the importance of ecology and ethics and how this all fits in. So a couple of ground rules.
You'll be in a listening mode only for most of the call. And if you have questions or comments, you can see, I believe there's a chat, a place for you to write those. And also, please, in the chat, enter your name, your city, so that we can know who you are and where you are. And I also want to take this time to acknowledge people from wherever you are in the United States, and especially in the Florida area. If you're here or in the Texas, Louisiana area, if you are in the Caribbean, wherever you are, where we've had or in Mexico. I was just in Mexico this past weekend. Or wherever there's some people experiencing the power and force of nature, I want to let you know that our prayers are with you, our blessings are with you, and if you're on this call, thank you. And our wish is that this can make a difference for you and for other people. Be punctual on these calls. That's the next thing we ask of you. We start at 4:30, and we'll go approximately 2 hours. Our other request of you is that you stay focused, meaning don't multitask. So turn off your phones, turn off your TVs, turn off all the stuff that you usually do, because one of the greatest, a big challenge that we face in our country right now in the world is how to stay focused, how to stay mindful and not be multitasking. And the next one is to practice, practice, practice. We're going to give you some things to practice in between the courses, the weeks, and have fun. We will definitely have fun. And the other thing we'll talk about in one of the presuppositions, which is quite handy in my life, is make all the mistakes that you want to make here, because we are learning. Yeah.
Absolutely. So I want to really emphasize both having fun and practice. So a lot of times people actually think that neuro-linguistic programming is really like learning something by book. But actually think of it more as like learning how to play a sport or music or martial arts. You can know all the theories, but unless you're practicing, it really doesn't do much good. So we really emphasize using some of the things that you'll be learning as much as possible. Okay, so before we jump into webinar, let me see how do we do session 1. I just want to see if we can, if there's any questions or comments. We're going to just check the comment section right now. Is there, okay. To see if there's anything that people are asking us.
Oh, they're from all over the place.
Okay. Well,
Mexico City. Hi. New York.
good. If you guys have any questions or comments at this point, go ahead and type it in. I don't see anything right now, just lots of nice hellos, which is great. Wonderful. And thank you for all, checking in with your name and places. All right, so we'll check in again. We'll leave some room for questions and answers, so we'll keep moving. All right, so.
Let me do one other thing, because we also want to see you. And we are recording this so that later on, if it's what we want to be able to offer it to more people online as a product that we sell. Mm-hmm. And for that, we'll need your permission. And if you don't want to do that, don't turn your video on. But we're going to now have someone turn your video on so that we can see you as well. But do not turn your video off if you don't want to be seen. And we'll send out some forms to you later on to sign for us to make it okay. So Chelsea, you ready to show them?
Yes, Betty, I'll do that right now.
Okay, thank you.
By the way, I know we said don't multitask, and when we're looking down, we're actually trying to check our times and so forth. So just want to let you know that we're not trying to.
We're not doing all the things we told them about.
Exactly. So and I'm so happy to be here with you, Betty. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah.
So let's jump into what is NLP and NLP and the coaching model. So we're going to go right into session 1. So I'm sure you guys heard of neuro-linguistic programming. So NLP neuro-linguistic programming is actually, I think, kind of a horrible name, because it was kind of made up, actually, to be honest. 2 guys, Richard Bandler and John Grinder, who are the founders. Well, the myth is that Richard Bandler was actually asked at some conference, what is it that you do? So he kind of made up a name really quickly. called neuro-linguistic programming. But it fits. So NeuroPart stands for really dealing with our thinking. It's really how we use our five senses to experience and understand the world. So the linguistic part is the fact that this is a study of communication, the way we use language and how it influences both ourselves and those around us. So, and the programming is the fact that ultimately none of this really matters unless this sort of manifests in a behavior that's relevant. So it's also part of NLP is study of our behavior in the end, how we organize our ideas, actions, and achieve specific desired goals and results. So in another way of saying this is that NLP is really the study of the structure of our subjective experiences. There's a couple of other ways I want to say this. So the core of neuro-linguistic programming is modeling. And I'm not talking about like runway modeling where you're looking good, but it's talking about modeling something to find out how something works. NLP has often been referred to as a study in human excellence. So the idea is that we can really understand, if we study somebody's behavior and break it down into small enough chunks, not only can we understand what they're doing, but we can actually replicate it. The other part about NLP is that it's really an attitude and an understanding that our words and beliefs not only describe the world we live in, but actually it creates our experience of it, and it actually creates our own reality. So this is one of the very strongest beliefs and attitudes that we have as NLP practitioners.
And this fits right in with, in terms of ontological coaching, that in the worldview piece. So and we'll get into that later as well here. But many people live as if the world is happening out there, and what we're saying, and NLP is agreeing with us finally, that it's an occurring world, and that we are creating our experience.
Absolutely. Yeah. And the other way I think of saying that is that we're the cause, not just the effect and response. So a lot of times when people talk about NLP, people kind of talk about different techniques that came out of NLP. But I actually want to make the distinction that the techniques is more of a byproduct of neuro-linguistic programming. And it's not the core. People get very impressed by different techniques that came out of it. That's used in sales and for all kinds of different things. But these techniques actually come from modeling somebody who can also already do it really well, right? So it is a methodology and a study of experiences of human behavior that leaves behind a trail of techniques. Okay, so a very brief history of neuro-linguistic programming. So NLP as a field is not that old. It's really started kind of back in the 70s. But even before that, what happened was there were incredible therapists and scientists, starting with Alfred Korzybski, who was actually a linguist, and he studied about how language shapes our reality and how people's model of the world is often influenced by the kind of language that they speak, and how, if you break down the structure of how language is constructed, that he can really teach a lot about the way people actually think and experience the world. And then there was Ivan Pavlov. I'm sure you guys heard about Pavlov's dogs, where there was a lot of study done about conditioning, about, for example, you heard that story about where when you ring a bell for the dogs, he conditioned the dogs to salivate because they linked that the sound of the bell with the dogs being fed. So it turns out that there's a lot of things that we get conditioned to, both naturally and intentionally. So this is something that we found to be very useful when we're studying NLP. But the majority of NLP actually in the beginning, in the early days, came from studying three phenomenal therapists. Milton Erickson, who is the father of hypnotherapy. he was sort of therapist for therapists. So when people had problems with their clients, so Milton Erickson was sort of the therapist of last resort, and he would have these miracle experiences. And similar thing with Fritz Perls. He was the father of Gestalt therapy. And Virginia Satir, who was the founder of family therapy. So what really distinguished these therapists were that often before, psychotherapy would take anywhere between 3 to 7 years, if not longer, before anyone able to sort of get to the root of the problem. Well, what happened with Virginia and Fritz Perls and Milton Erickson is that they would often have these amazing results with clients within a session. So what happened was there were two people in UC Santa Cruz back in 1970s. Richard Bandler used to work for Virginia Satir, and he started studying what the methodology was for Satir being so effective. John Grinder, who was actually a professor of linguistics at that time, came across Richard doing his stuff and made him this very interesting proposal. He said, I will teach you what you're doing if you can teach, Actually, he says, if you teach me what you're doing, I'll teach you how you're doing it. Because even though Richard was able to do like incredible stuff that he was learning from Virginia Satir, he couldn't quite explain it. And John Grinder, coming from a linguistic background, and also he was a very interesting background. He was a Green Beret, CIA, and also a CIA operative before he went completely the other way and became a communist for a while. So he was actually really, really good at breaking things down and figuring out how things work. So these two guys kind of got started with codifying these sort of secrets of these three amazing therapists. And then one of their earliest students, I'm sure you've heard of Tony Robbins, he was so excited when he started learning about NLP that he ended up helping people right away. And as you know, he's done some phenomenal stuff with NLP and for himself to succeed. In fact, one of the things that got him really started was when he was first learning NLP with John Grinder. John Grinder gave him a homework. He said, why don't you go ahead and study something that's very unusual and see if you can break it down and teach people how to do it. So Anthony Robbins actually went to study how people did firewalking. So these were kind of like this mystical experience. And he was able to actually break that down, figure out how they did it. And then, as you know, in his seminars, he's probably had hundreds of thousands of people now do firewalks without, very little training.
And the thing about Tony, too, was I met him in 1980 before NLP.
Right.
And
yeah, that's cool.
Office in Los Angeles, and he went to do and study NLP with these two guys. Mm-hmm. And when he came back, he was a different man.
Right. And actually, the person that I studied is actually Tony's coach. So we all have coaches. And Robert Dilts and Judith Delosier are really the first generation NLPers. They were students and innovators, right, with Richard Bandler and John Grinder. And they had never stopped studying it. So they've been innovating and contributing to the field of NLP for the last 35 years. So that's a pretty brief history. And I want to kind of give you a sense that NLP is actually a pretty broad topic, because if you think of NLP at its core as modeling, well, there's a lot of things that we can model. So some of the stuff that people learn in the practitioner's course are things like presuppositions, sensory acuity, language, how to build rapport, sustain rapport, sometimes how to break it, and also the concept of really knowing what you want and defining your outcomes. And also being able to change your own states so that you can have great state management. So there are lots of topics. What we've chosen to do for our 4-week seminar is to really kind of cherry pick what we think are the most relevant and useful for you as coaches and leaders. So, but do not think that actually we're going to be covering everything that you will be experts at NLP within 4 weeks.
Well, let's see. Questions, comments?
So let's
Is
see.
that-
Let's
see what.
Let's see if we
You see some
can
people.
see how we can go and
Chat.
some questions.
Any questions? Go to chat. Let's see.
Okay. So far, okay, we don't see too many questions. Of course, there's a lot of chat, so it's hard for us to see it very quickly. Okay.
Okay, we want to check in with you occasionally, see if we have rapport with you and what's happening out there. I see some faces I recognize.
Okay.
Right.
You guys, a lot of you guys look really serious. Well, some of you guys are smiling, so we want you to actually let's start with this. You know, one of the things that's actually key to success is actually your physiology. This is actually one of the things that are taught in live training. So, quick interactive exercise. I'd like you guys to all sit up straight, take some deep breath, square your shoulders. See if you can get both of your feet to like be rooted on the earth, touch the floor. Take a couple of deep breaths and feel yourself just really arrive, right? And put a big smile on your face. And as you do that, think of yourself and say, oh God, I'm so depressed. I'm so miserable. Doesn't really work, does it? Right? Well, this is why part of our state management is so important. And same thing, if you like scrouch down, make yourself small, and then breathe really shallowly, look down, and then say to yourself, oh, I'm so happy. Doesn't work, right? Okay, come back. So as we practice this, sit up straight and practice excellent physiology, which is first part of state management. So let's go back to our little slides again. Oops. So one way I like to actually, when I was learning NLP, I found it was really confusing because there are so many different components of it. So one way of actually looking at this is that there's sort of 4 important frameworks that are nested within each other. First, and for framework also you can think of it as keys to success. So one of the most important things when you're practicing NLP is to think about, well, what is it that you want? What is the outcome that you want? So many of us actually kind of go through our lives really just reacting to things. Like when you're in a conversation, we might just have a conversation, but not really think about, well, what is it that we really want from this conversation, right? And this is especially important in coaching. So you don't go just into a coaching and say, okay, go ahead and chat, and then spend an hour together. Sometimes that could be useful for exploration, but usually a client comes to you because they have a certain outcome in mind. So the first thing that we need to establish is to really define and identify what is it that we want in any situation, and especially for an LP. The second is actually to create rapport. And rapport is really the idea of how to create trust and safety in a relationship. So nothing happens without rapport. So you need, you've probably all heard that saying, people want to know that you like them before they know that you're right. And this is so true. People often won't even listen to another person unless they have a sense of rapport with them. So The second key to success is really kind of being able to build rapport very quickly. And the reason why we have this number 1, is that that's what we're going to be covering in session 1. Rapport we'll be covering much more in session 2 and 3. The third important concept is ecology. So a lot of times we might have an outcome, but that may actually be a very sort of surface level outcome that may not be rooted in your deepest beliefs or values. So this is actually true when you think about somebody who wants to quit smoking. A lot of times, if you just get somebody to quit smoking without kind of checking what is the benefit that they are getting from smoking, perhaps it's the time that when people smoke, that's the time that they give a little break from themselves, or maybe that's when they're actually taking a little bit of some good clean air as they go outside. I know it sounds a little weird because they're actually putting smoke in their lungs, but often there's a benefit why someone does anything, right? So checking ecology is making sure that you are aware of the consequences. And we'll be going through more of that on this session and also in session 4. And then finally, the key to success and the framework for NLP is then the techniques. So the techniques for NLP that, like I said, comes from modeling people who already do something really, really well, or reverse engineering something that someone's doing that you don't want to happen, like allergies, for example, or phobias. But what we found is that a lot of these techniques don't really work until you have the first 3. So you need to have an outcome, you need to have rapport, and you need to be able to check ecology in order for the techniques to really work. And so this is kind of what we're going to be covering today. The ecology, systemic ecology, sensory acuity. We'll talk a little bit more about that later, but that's being able to be, that sensory acuity is being able to notice what is happening with the person. Because even if you do all things right, if you're not really paying attention and if you don't know what to look for, then you're not going to be very effective in making changes. The other thing is actually behavioral flexibility. The more flexible that we can be in our behavior, actually we're going to be far more successful in being able to achieve the outcome that we want. So don't worry about memorizing all of this. We will be going over the most important ones as we go through the sessions. At this point, we just wanted to give you sort of an overview and general idea of what goes into a traditional NLP training.
And also how we use this already in ontological thinking in our ideal coaching.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you remember, one of the first competencies of the ICF, second competency, is to establish what the client wants to accomplish, even in the session, not just overall in terms of their outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, with presence, another ICF competency that we study and that we're always practicing. But it becomes very important. What do people want? And then how to have that become an outcome, not just something they want or wish for. And we'll get into that too, with everything that we were just speaking about here. Yes?
Yes. Okay, let's get to the next one. So, how can we use NLP for coaches and leaders? So, learning NLP, as we said, is going to help you build and sustain rapport with people very quickly. This is one of the most useful skills I personally learned. And this will serve you actually well, not just in coaching or in leadership roles, but really with anyone. I mean, you are always communicating and interacting with people. So if you can create that sense of rapport and friendliness with people quickly, imagine what's going to happen to you in your jobs or even at Starbucks, for example, right? Not that this is a not that I'm pushing for this, but just by learning rapport skills, I've actually gotten like free Starbucks coffee just because I was friendly and people felt comfortable around me. So anyway, the other way NLP is useful is that it really helps you to be aware of yourself. Calibrate just means you are becoming self-aware and becoming aware of others. So by practicing sensory acuity, by being able to notice what's happening with people, notice what's happening with yourself, you're going to have a lot more awareness of what to do. The techniques that we'll be covering is going to help definitely to create changes in the clients that you might be working with, or the people that you're like leading, for example. And we're always influencing or being influenced by other people. So one of the great things about NLP is that you'll have a much more keen awareness of when you're being influenced, and also how you can influence people in a way that's very positive. So let me tell you a quick story about like how actually, when I had this moment of like, wow, NLP is just amazing, and how I applied NLP. I was in this workshop the other day, and it was nothing to do with NLP, but it was actually more of a spiritual workshop. And I noticed there was this young man who was just very kind, but every time he started speaking about something that was fairly emotional, he would start stuttering. In fact, when he started talking about something that was really emotional to him, something that he really cared about, he would literally go into a little small seizures. So like everything would stop. So I thought, I learned some techniques from NLP, and I thought I could help him. So I ended up offering my help to see if he wanted to kind of explore the symptoms with me. And turns out for this sort of symptom of having stutters and seizures, he was seeing a therapist, a psychotherapist, for 2.5 years, twice a week. So think about how much all of that, time that he had spent. We were able to actually resolve that in 30 minutes. He never had that problem again. And that was the power of NLP for me that really opened my eyes about how quickly we can affect change in people.
Yeah, I just want to say, when I studied NLP, maybe my first course 20 some years ago, after having come out of the transformational training model, this allowed me to pull back the curtains and see what was going on. And that's what I appreciate about NLP, and what I appreciate about the kind of coaching that we offer people is not just looking at the surface, but what's behind it, what's happening, what's the context, what's the thinking, what's the language, what's going on, so that this is occurring possibly in the way that's occurring.
Absolutely. So, and here are some other sort of fields of application for neurolinguistic programming. I'm not going to read all of it, but some of the ways that it's been used is to overcoming phobias. Turns out that you can actually do that very, very quickly using NLP. We can manage our own states. We can build and maintain and motivate both ourselves and team by learning some of the NLP techniques. This has also been phenomenal for relationships. I said that I actually went through some big life transitions before learning neurolinguistic programming. And part of what I learned actually in NLP was that what happened with my relationship at that time was just that my ex-wife and I were using very different language skills. And we were creating and sort of communicating in a way that really made it difficult for us to understand each other. So imagine if you could really communicate with others in a way that they could hear and they want to hear, right? Okay. So the coaching model is actually pretty simple. So at bottom, basically we have a present problem, which is the present state. And then we have our desired state, the outcome that we want. So what we do in the NLP coaching model is identify our present problem, identify our desired solution, and then find the resources to be able to actually make the change. So in a nutshell, that's what the process is. It's a very simple 3-step process.
And we can use that to even think about what's happening in Florida, what's happening in Texas. There's a desired outcome.
Mm-hmm.
And the desired outcome that I'm finding is that people they want safety, they want their home, they want food, they want water, they want shelter. They want all the things that would have someone be comfortable in their physical life and their emotional life as well. So then there's a present problem. And now, what are the resources? And not just resources like things, but also how do we put people in a resourceful state so that they can go and create what it is they need? And as I've been watching some of the stories on TV, what's been most interesting and amazing to me is that some people were in a resourceful state, and I had confidence that they were going to go and take care of the things that they needed to take care of. And some people were more like, when we were talking earlier, they were bent over
Mm-hmm.
like this. And if we could just be with people to have them move into a resourceful state, they will better take care of the things that they need to take care of in their lives. And I encourage all of you and all my coaches, or not just my coaches, but anyone, any place that can reach out to someone and have them move into a resourceful state, then do that. It will make a difference.
Absolutely. I'm just checking for any questions. So there was actually a comment that the PowerPoint provided, the note page that we sent you with the slide does not match the one shown 100%. That's actually correct. There were a few minor changes that were made. So that's why we have that little area next to the slides for you to be able to take notes. But the essential information is all there. But it is slightly you will find some slight differences between what was sent and the actual slides. Okay. And if you have any questions or comments, go ahead and type it in, and we will check, as I said, occasionally as we go along. Okay, let's go back. So read this. So, as we said, we wanted to talk about the intention at this point, and the integrity and ecology. As we mentioned, we're always communicating. It's as human beings living in a society with other human beings, we cannot not communicate. Even if you're absolutely silent and not moving, that in itself is a communication. That gives impression to other people about you. Therefore, we are always influencing and being influenced by others. So often the question that I get when I'm teaching NLP or when talking about NLP is just that, well, isn't NLP, can it be manipulative? And my answer to that is that, well, it depends on your intention and in your integrity. For example, fire is a powerful, powerful tool, right? But it can both be used to heat and warm us and cook our food, or it can be used to burn down things. So the difference between manipulation and how we positively influence people is really lying in our intention and our personal integrity. And this is also really important for ecology, because what happens is that, there's sort of there is sort of a kind of a thing that comes back at you if you don't pay attention to ecology. To give you an example, when I first was learning NLP, I thought, oh, this is amazing. I can be in fantastic feel-good state all the time. So I was always practicing like being super positive and super happy. Turns out though, that wasn't quite ecological, because especially when I going through some of my sadness about getting a divorce, I wasn't learning the lessons that I needed to learn, because I was sort of resisting what the information and lesson that comes from that state. So later on, I found out, even though I was able to easily change it, that it actually took me longer for me to learn some of the life lessons that I probably could have learned a lot easier had I really accepted and gone through some of the feelings that I was feeling.
Yeah, and ecology, in this sense, and we talk about ecology, the ecological worldview that's emerging, not only just for us personally, but as we navigate and live on this planet, we live in an environment, and we are not exempt from the environment. And we also spend a lot of time with our bodies, which is also a part of, it's systemic thinking, that we are part of a system, and we are whole, and yet we are part of a system. And to understand that is ecological thinking. It's a whole mindset. And I find that when people can begin to view themselves in the world ecologically, they have deeper peace,
Yes.
deeper connection, more abundance and aliveness, because we stop living in this isolated self. That's a myth anyway. And we start to recognize that we're part of a whole system, a part and a whole at the same time.
Absolutely. And we'll talk about systems actually in one of the sessions more in depth. But we're all really part of the system. Once again, ecology is important because it really checks actually our congruence with who we are, our overall goals and values of the individual. Oops. Okay. By the way, so to check for ecology, what we do in NLP is we ask good, relevant questions, and we do what's called a future pace. So we'll go over some of the questions both in this session and later sessions. And future pacing means actually we think of the situation basically in the future and act as if we're going through it. It's basically rehearsing the change so that when we get into the situation, we already are practiced in it. So think of it as practicing martial arts, right? So you're practicing, you're actually future pacing by when you're doing katas and different sort of exercises, because by the time you get there, you want that to be in your muscles already. So this is exactly what we're doing with NLP. Anything else about that?
Yeah, when in 1990, I believe it was, and I was considering leaving the company that I was working with, LifeSpring at the time, as a transformational trainer. A good friend of mine, he knew I was deciding in what was I gonna do with the rest of my life, and he spent a few hours with me just around this outcomes, the ecology of it, and then in 2 days, I kid you not, I had left my company and was on to a whole nother track. Because that's why while we spend so much time around well-formed outcomes and then the ecology of it, not just saying I want something and then keep behaving the way you've always behaved, is not going to have that show up. And so in our coaching, that's why we spend time around practices, the thinking, the language, the ways of being. Because once you have the whole ecology, then it's almost impossible for you not to
Absolutely.
Have show up what it is you're committed to. And that leads us to NLP presuppositions. And some of you are familiar with those. So presuppositions are saying something, they're presupposing something. And I say this quite often, they're not the truth, but it's a way of interpreting. You're presupposing something about you, about the world, And these are the presuppositions of NLP. And the first one that we work with, there's no failure, only feedback.
Mhm.
So
let me just add one more thing about presupposition is that they're basically empowering beliefs. We're not, one of the interesting thing about NLP is that we're less concerned with whether something is true or not, because a lot of things we actually don't know if it's true because they're subjective. So what we ask instead is it useful or is it empowering? So presuppositions are basically beliefs that we found through experience to be very powerful because they make us more effective and better NLP practitioners. So the first one is,
there's no failure, only feedback. And just imagine throughout your life the number of times that you have failed at something. Did you really fail? Or just like this is said, I have not failed, I just found 10,000 ways that won't work. It's a whole nother mindset. It's a whole nother way to approach life. And it's like putting this webinar together. There are many opportunities where it wasn't going the way I wanted it to go or somebody else wanted to go. And the commitment and the intention and the well-formed outcomes allow for us to find the ways that will have us accomplish what we came here to accomplish. And of course, here's one of my second favorite basketball players.
who's the first favorite?
Stephen Curry. Okay.
Yes, of course.
So, and what is that? I missed more than 9,000 shots in my career. I've lost almost 200 games. 26 times I've been trusted to take the game's winning shot and missed. I failed over and over and over again in my life, and that is why I succeeded.
So this is a really useful, this was actually one of the most powerful things that I actually learned from NLP, is not to take failure as something that was bad and be judgmental about it. We're actually very fortunate to live near Silicon Valley. And we have a saying in Silicon Valley, fail fast, fail forward. People expect you to fail if you're going to learn something. So the idea is that rather than be judgmental about something not working out, really taking the attitude of, well, what is it that I learned from this? And I found that actually to be incredibly useful.
Yeah, and one of the things we stress at our school also is learning and learning to learn.
Mm-hmm.
We're convinced that unless people learn how to navigate in this world today, they're not going to be very successful. They're not going to have much peace, much joy, because the world is we're constantly shifting the world. And as we shift the world, we have to become different navigators in that world.
Absolutely. Yes. So let's go to our second presupposition we'll cover in this session, which is map is not the territory. So that might be confusing for people who have never heard of this before. So this actually comes from Milton Erickson about the way he viewed the world. So basically they're making so he was making the distinction that reality and our representation of it are two different things. Map is only a map. It's not the territory itself, right? For example. Oops, and I realized there was a big spelling mistake in that. Apologies. So if you look at this map, for example, it represents the landscape behind it, but you can't hike on the map. You can't smell the flowers in the map. You can't get lost in the map. Well, maybe you can. But anyway, it's making the distinction that our representation is only a representation and not the reality itself. So this has several implications. It means that you need to, one, respect other people's maps, and also realize that making changes in the map is not making changes in the actual reality. So I like this little cartoon, right? Oops. So your x-ray showed a broken rib, but we fixed it with Photoshop. So that's like changing the map, but not changing the reality. So we want to make the distinction that um, that we all have different maps, basically, and they are not all the same. So this actually helps us, first of all, to really understand the concept of rapport. Because one of the often mistakes that we make as human beings is assume that how other people see the world or see certain situation is exactly the same as we do it, right? And that doesn't work. There's a famous story of actually Milton Erickson, who was asked to work with a with patient in a psychiatric hospital. So he was led into the psychic ward, and he was introduced to this one young man who was convinced he was Jesus Christ. And of course, everybody, the doctors been telling him, they were trying to convince him that he's not the Jesus Christ. And of course, he resisted because the patient, in his mind, everybody was trying to prove him wrong. So the more the doctors try to prove to him that he wasn't Jesus Christ, the more resistance he got. Well, when Milton Erickson met him, he just accepted that he believed he was Jesus Christ. And in fact, what he did was, when he started building a little cabinet, he called the patient up and he said, "So, I understand you're a carpenter." And that was kind of way he got into the other person's map, right? Got into his world. And once he created that rapport, that opened up the client's really mind to Milton Erickson, because he was thinking like, finally, here's somebody who understands me, who gets me. So that's how Milton Erickson was able to create change, first by building rapport.
And also in our school, when we speak about worldview, it's very similar. It's not the same. It's distinct in a number of ways. But worldview is it's like I said, our map, our view of the world, and with our map and our view, we're also shaping reality. But as an observer, you become a different kind of observer and observe that the way you are seeing it, your perceptions, your thinking, your language is shaping the world. But to try to change the world out there and not be present to your own maps or somebody else's maps will not have you have the kind of success that's available to you. So it's a both and.
Great. So we've been actually talking for exactly almost an hour. And we did actually build in a little 5-minute break. So this is a chance for you guys to go to the bathroom or get a cup of coffee or just stand up and shake it, shake out, exactly, shake it around a little bit. So I'm going to ask you guys to come back exactly in 5 minutes, and we're going to take a quick 5-minute break. And by the way, if you want to type in questions now, this would be a great time. Questions?
Welcome back. Any questions? We're looking for some. Comments?
I know it's a lot of materials coming at you, and so we want to see if you guys have any comments or questions at this point.
No? Okay, very good then.
Okay.
Now, this part that we're about to go in now really altered my world when I took NLP. And
Okay.
so pay attention.
So we were just talking about the map is not the territory. So this actually relates to the NLP model of communication, how we communicate with ourselves and with the world. So the external world, when we have an event, for example, we are sensing it through our five senses. VAKOG stands for visual, auditory, kinesthetic, which is touch, olfactory, which is smell, and gustatory. So far as we're aware of right now, these are the five different senses that we actually experience the world, right? Well, it turns out that this is tremendous amounts of information. Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, who's a Hungarian biologist, he wrote a book called The Flow. And in the book, he talks about that actually we are getting 2 million bits of information per every second. So that's a lot of information. So what do we do with all that information? We actually have to filter it. It's just too much information for our cognitive mind. So we filter all of this information through our beliefs, our past experiences, the values we have. So whatever it is that we're focusing actually chunks all of that information down to 134 bits per second, right? Which is a lot, much smaller. So from 2 million, we chunk it down to a fraction, tiny fraction of that in a conscious level. So 7 plus or minus 2 means that we can only really pay attention to 7 plus or minus 2 things at a time, but you can't really be aware of everything at once, right? So that's what we can pay attention to. So what does that mean? It means that we're actually constantly deleting in our mind of what's really happening. We're distorting information, and we're also creating generalizations. So, you know, like for example, when people witness an accident, if you have 10 people witnessing 10 different, the same accident, you'll have 10 very different accounts of what actually happened. So with this information that we delete, distort, and generalize, we actually gets also filtered into our physiology, and this creates our internal state, or the way we're feeling at this point. And then the feeling that we have also really determine how we then express that into our behavior. So we will get a little bit more concrete, but we wanted to give you the model about this in a quick sense.
Okay, someone has requested that we repeat what VAKOG is.
Oh, excellent. Okay. So VAKOG stands for visual, auditory, kinesthetic, olfactory, and gustatory. So it refers to 5 different senses. Visual, of obviously being sight, auditory being our hearing, kinesthetic, sense of touch, olfactory, sense of smell. Gustatory is our sense of taste. By the way, you should have all received a glossary of NLP in one of your pre-session handouts. So all of this are listed in there. Oops. So we're getting little chat, so if you get distracted. So we had a small technical difficulties where we were hoping to break people out into little mini breakout rooms, but we're not going to be able to do that this particular time. Hopefully we'll have it figured out by the next session. But we wanted to kind of get people to really talk about these two questions. And maybe what you can do is you can think about these two questions and think about it and jot it to yourself, or in that little slides notebook page, the notes that you have. See if you can answer these two questions. One is, share an example for one of the presuppositions that seems relevant to you. Now, for example, for me, map is not territory was a fantastic presupposition that really made me realize that how other people view the world is really not the same way I view the world. And that gave me a lot more understanding, and it gave me a lot more flexibility in being able to interact with people. The other presupposition, failure, there is no failure, only feedback, was also really very useful to me because I was able to take that and not be so judgmental when I failed at something, right? So the second question is, think about how can these two presuppositions be useful to you in coaching or leading others? Now notice we're actually future pacing you. Remember we talked about the future pace? So by asking this question, we're asking you to think about how these two presuppositions can be applied in your either in the future coaching or leadership situations. So we'll give you guys a couple of minutes to think about this and write it down. And if any of you guys want to actually type your answers, copy or paste it to the chat so that we can read it. If you guys want to share that, that'd be great. So we'll give you a couple of minutes. Okay, so the question was, what is the second question? And the second question was, how can these two presuppositions be useful in coaching or leading others? So let me share the questions again with you guys.
And you can type them into the chat room and we'll look at them. Juice.
Okay. So, take this out.
Just the first two, the ones that we talked about.
So we will go over the other presupposition in different sessions. We find that when we cover all the presuppositions at once, it's just too much information for people. So we're just taking 2 or 3 at a time. Okay, about another 20 seconds.
Someone else? See what they're writing. Some people are writing some things.
Okay. There's a good example.
Okay. Someone wrote, what is it?
Presupposition example of there is no failure, only feedback. 2 ex-husbands taught me what I needed to develop in terms of successful relationships. I'm now married 30 years. That's a fantastic example. Thank you. That's a great one.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, absolutely.
And it becomes very powerful also in having, especially with children,
Mm-hmm.
and working with them so that they can take risk and they're not labeled a failure. That's what we're saying. There are no failures. It's something we say about ourselves, and then we get locked into that characterization of being a failure, and it limits our possibilities and our ability to act. So what we're saying, everything is feedback. That's why ecology, systemic thinking is so important. Everything is giving you feedback. Like when I was in Mexico and there was the earthquake last week on Thursday night, it showed us feedback to me about, and what I needed to do was to move, right? It wasn't being mad at the earthquake. It wasn't anything like that. It's go, okay, there's an earthquake. What do you do in Mexico when there's an 8.1 earthquake? What do? You start to move.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the people who were there, they were telling me exactly what to do, where to go, grab my shoes. They forgot to tell me to grab my cell phone, so I ran back to get it. But again, feedback. Quite often how we hear feedback, even some of you in the coaching program, you start to use your feedback and turn it on yourself as if you're bad, wrong, somebody else is bad or wrong. But it's a whole different way of listening, and it's a whole different way of working with people so that they can be in a resourceful state and begin to listen to your feedback in a way that you can utilize it to navigate with, to shape your world as you work with other people in this wonderful adventure called life that we're all in together. And you must have feedback and have a way to listen to the feedback without criticizing yourself. Huh?
And we're getting some great examples. Somebody also said that this failure versus feedback is really useful for business. Yes, absolutely. This is all, actually, you know, I found that I have a friend who runs a very successful consulting business. He actually does franchise consulting. And he found out that on average, his clients who have a very successful franchise business, they failed 6 times before they hit a very successful business. Mm-hmm. So they actually learn from all those, quote, failures from creating this amazing businesses later on. Somebody else wrote that this is very useful for a reminder that it's about the client, not about me. Yes, that's absolutely true. A lot of times we have to focus on us when it's really about some other people. Beautiful. Okay. So thank you so much for these great comments. Let's go ahead and move on to the next portion. So I want to talk a little bit more about our brain at this time. Neuroscience is actually starting to provide a lot of backup to NLP and like mindfulness and meditation. But it's interesting because a lot of this actually wasn't just made up. Neuro-linguistic program was actually, it came about by studying people in real life experiences. But one of the, I guess, the shortcoming for NLPs is that in the earlier days, especially, they didn't do a great job of making it very research-based, academic-based. So it wasn't quite as recognized as an academic topic. But now it's interesting because there's a lot of evidence to say that stuff that's come out of NLP actually is really supported by brain science. So I want to talk a little bit about the fact that our brain is actually not one brain. We often think that it's like this beautiful organic whole piece that sort of came out about miraculously. But if you think about how our brain developed from an evolutionary sense, it first developed as a very small reptilian brain, a very beginning part, which is really the nervous system. And that deals with our stuff like basic survival, being able to breathe, and it still really takes over under stress times. And as we developed evolutionary and became mammals, we developed a limbic system, which is sort of what we call the midbrain, that goes over the top of the original reptilian nervous system. And that has to do a lot more to do with emotions, okay? As mammals, if you notice any animals, for example, they react emotionally. They go into fear, they go into anger. And these are very useful in helping us survive also, right? And also how to interact socially. And then our third part of our brain, our prefrontal cortex, is our modern brain. That's the latest part of our brain that was added to our whole brain structure. And that's what allows us to think cognitively, think about the future, think about the past, create models, and so forth. The problem is that often when we're under stress, our more primitive brain, our older systems takes over. So although we like to think that our prefrontal cortex, so sort of our modern brain, actually controls everything, often that's not the case. We're often being controlled or managed by parts of our older brain.
Unless,
Yes.
what?
Go ahead.
Unless we apply mindfulness practices to open up this part of our brain, and then that gives us the executive in our life,
Exactly.
a way that, not to control, not even to manage, but to be present in a whole nother way. And that's what practicing does. That's what mindfulness is about. As we tell you in our course, practice your mindfulness practices, not just 10 minutes on the couch or your cushion, but begin to have mindfulness practices and walking and eating and thinking, and then something else starts to emerge where you're not always at effect of the world. We begin to have a kind of peace and direction with your life.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So Betty is talking about this slide that we're going into, which is that our brains have neuroplasticity. We used to think that brain, once we were born, we were kind of stuck with it. Turns out that actually our brains can change and grow well into our adulthood, and it actually keeps growing well, all the way to our death. And what's really interesting is that our brain changes based on what we think about. So focus actually changes the brain. This is kind of what we thought.
This is so powerful. And it's not focus like positive thinking, but it's focus with what we call calibration,
Right.
congruity. And as it says here, what you focus on grows.
Right.
So where are you going to put your focus? And again, that is the powerful of mindfulness. It's becoming so well known here in the West. And they're beginning to see the practicality of mindfulness, like you with Google, right?
Yes. So I'm one of the certified teachers for Search Inside Yourself program, SILI, Search Inside Yourself Leadership Institute, which is a mindfulness program that came out of Google. And because it's Google, they were able to really tap into the best minds in the world, as well as spiritual leaders to really create their program. And there's a lot of actually neuroscience. They have a bunch of neuroscientists on board advising them. And this is all based on evidence that whatever we focus on starts to change our brain and it makes growth. So there's a really famous case about actually where they study the brains of cab drivers, taxi drivers in London. Before GPS, now it's probably a little bit different, but before the London taxi cab drivers, they had to study London maps. And they had to become, they had to actually really, in order to get their license, really know the streets in and out of London. And what they found when they measured the brains of the taxi cab drivers before and after licensing is that parts of the brain that deals with space and map and orientation actually grew in size. So the more you think about it, the more our brain will adapt and it will become easier for us to think about that certain things. Okay, so anything you want to add before we move? The next topic is a little bit, it's a kind of a big shift in topic, so I want to make sure. We're going to just check any comments. So some cute comments there.
Yeah, the map is not the territory is phenomenal. I see that creating a neutral space to step into someone else's world without getting caught up in who is right or wrong. And this is the power of becoming a different kind of observer and observing people's maps, observing the way the world occurs for different people. And that kind of observer goes into, we won't get into the mystical side of this, but the great mystics and the great teachers, they had an understanding of this. And they had an understanding of reality and what generates what we call reality. And so when you can observe that even your own map is not the way that it is, and then you can start to play with the map. You can start to make new maps. And when you can start to make new maps, then you will have a different kind of life.
Excellent. So, ready for the next topic? I know this is a lot of information, but we got a lot to cover.
So wait 1 second.
Oops,
wait one.
Okay.
Let me see.
Okay, wait. How do I get out of that?
Oh, well, I want to see that. Just one more.
Okay.
So
yes.
now, if this is being helpful for you, do a thumbs up sign.
Okay, good. Nice thumbs. All right.
Okay, good.
Very good. Okay, so one of the things that we promised in the webinar is to talk about being a better communicator, right? So the first way, sorry, it takes a while. The two areas that we're going to cover, and I'm giving you an overview today, so don't worry about having to know all of this right now. We're just giving you a little taste of it, but we're going to go more into this in actually, I think, session 3. But there's two basically language models that we're going to be dealing with in NLP that's been really useful. And this was actually also one of the first things that early NLP practitioners learned. One is called the meta model, and one is called the Milton model. Meta model came from Virginia Satir and from Fritz Perls. Because what they found, sorry, I don't know why this keeps going back that way. So meta model is a way of reversing the deletion, distortion, and generalization. Because what they found is that the way that Fritz Perls and Virginia Satir were using language with their clients somehow created this amazing instantaneous changes by recovering greater possibilities of how they looked at the world, right? So meta model, it helps you to gather information, right? Basically, when we are processing information and experiencing it, remember we delete and distort and generalize a lot, right? So by asking certain questions, we can receive some information that were either distorted or deleted. The second thing is that it gets a lot more specific. So often people will talk in great generalizations, which sounds right, but it actually, when you drill down to it, it's not specific enough to actually have any real meaning. So meta model, what that does is it gives you a certain framework, set of questions for asking, what is it exactly that what exactly do you mean? And the third thing that meta model does is that it also identifies really the sort of what the limits of your map is. So when you're talking to a client, for example, in a coaching situation, by asking meta model questions, you can find out, well, where are they stuck? Where in their map of the world is so limited that they can't see other possibilities. So by asking the right type of questions or statements, you can actually change and challenge people's map to discover what their limits are and really expand that person's map and really choices. And Milton model does the opposite. So it turns out Milton Erickson would have very similar results, except the type of words that he were using was completely different. Turns out, remember Milton Erickson he was a medical doctor, but he had studied a lot of hypnosis. And what he was doing was he would actually get people into trance a lot. And he did that by building rapport and cooperation. So he would basically chunk language up, which means he would use language to make the meaning even more vague and less specific. And the purpose of that was by making it vague and less specific, it allowed for the person to have their own interpretation and meaning for the words, which often creates rapport, right? And so this is very effective when you want to create rapport, influence, or persuade other people. The second thing is that when you use Milton model, because you are using a very trance-like language, it tends to access the unconscious understandings of people. So it's a kind of a shortcut of bypassing our cognitive mind and conscious mind to really get into a deeper understanding and accessing the brain, part of our brain that we don't really conscious it on a daily basis. And ultimately, it does very kind of same thing that the meta model does, which is it loosens and it expands the listener's model of the world. So by creating a more looser interpretation, that can also create more possibilities for people. Oops. Let's see.
You have a few questions around that model.
Okay.
People want to know, are these both NLP models then?
Great.
Can you see the chat there?
I'm in the share page, so I can't see the chat right now. Let me go back to it. Okay. Okay, thank you for your question, first of all. Yes, so first of all, I don't want you guys to stress out about the language models, getting it right the first time. I'm giving you a sort of a very high level overview, helicopter view of the language models. So the language model is basically used in two ways. One is to become more specific and to reverse the generalization, deletion, and distortion that happens naturally when we filter information and create a map in our own mind. So remember we said that we all have different maps of the world, and that's based on our values, beliefs, or also our past experiences. So meta model, which is a sort of type of language and questions that we'll go over more later, are basically sets of questions and statements that are designed to become more specific, to clarify what the person is actually meaning. And the Milton model, it also does a similar thing of expanding the map of the world, but in an opposite direction. What it does is it creates rapport, and it puts people into a sort of a trance by using words that are very vague. So for example, let's say, this is actually often used a lot by politicians. And once you learn this, by the way, you'll never be able to see the politicians the same way again, because now you'll see it, you'll listen to them all the time using it. So for example,
I just want to say, if we look at this last election, not to get into politics, but there's a very specific way of speaking that was using exactly what we're talking about here.
Right.
Right.
So like for example, if I say freedom is great, now that's a very vague word, freedom, right? Who's going to disagree with freedom is great, right?
It could, but it would be.
Yeah, mostly people are going to say that's great, but if I became really specific, and if I said, well, being able to sleep until 3 p.m. is great because that's my freedom, right? Then maybe people will go, oh, wait a minute, maybe that's not so great, especially if I'm 14-year-old teenager and I'm talking to my mom and I'm saying like, well, I want my freedom of being able to sleep until 3 p.m. every day. Then you're going to have some like disagreements, right? So by being vague, by saying something very general like freedom is great, there's no, at this point, time for friction, right? Because it's something that we can both interpret as something that's meaningful to us. So like, for example, politicians will say something like, well, let's make sure that America is great again, right? Well, that can mean a lot of things to a lot of different people. So it's very hard to disagree with let's make America great, because that could mean something completely different to different people. But as a concept, it's very hard to disagree with that statement. So that would be the Milton model. And the reason why that's useful is that it creates a rapport with the speaker and the person who's listening. Does that make sense?
And we're doing this all the time. Raise your hand if it makes sense.
Okay, good.
But this is why we're always being influenced and we're always influencing. And it's happening through language and communication. And this past weekend in Mexico, there was a young man in there who's the manager for Facebook in Mexico. And we're having a conversation about Mark Zuckerberg, in that he got in on something about the social reality that we live in. And the social reality has to do with conversation, connection, rapport, and all of that allowed for us to have what we now call Facebook, right? And so when you get in on and get behind the scenes to see what's happening with human beings in terms of communication, in terms of listening, speaking, deleting, distorting, observing people's worldviews, you begin to have access to another source of creation and creating that may not be available to you right now. And that's one of the outcomes we want for you in terms of this course and the work in our coaching school, is that you really begin to have a different understanding of what's happening with people so that you can then be more effective and also have them be more effective.
Yes. And listen, don't worry about, like I said, getting it right. We're just giving you the high concept for now. In the early days of NLP training, people used to spend 6 months just on NLP models, on the language models. So it can get pretty in-depth in there. Somebody asked a question, are there only 2 language models in NLP? There are more. We're only going to be covering Meta model and Milton model for now, but there are things like metaphors and also sleight of mouth, which is a way of reframing how people think about things. So,
give an example of that one.
Okay, sleight of mouth. A great example is one was used by Jesus Christ. I think some of you guys might know the story about when a woman was about to be stoned because she was known as an adulterer. And, so at that time, Jesus Christ was seen as a rabbi. So he could not directly contradict that law of stoning an adulterer. So what he actually said was he used a technique of reframing by asking, let those among you who have no sin cast the first stone, right? So he didn't directly contradict the law, but he reframed it by sort of doing a verbal jujitsu, verbal aikido, to change people's way of reacting, right? So that's an example of sleight of mouth. So there are, and these are all very, very useful, but we would need a lot more time in the webinars, and we will be offering some other courses in the future to go in depth. But we wanted to, like I said, cherry pick the most useful to you as coaches and leadership and as leaders. Okay.
Yeah, and also those of you who have not yet been in the coaching course that we offer, there's a place we do a lot of work with this, and we keep learning. And those of you who have been in there and are students, that's why we're having this webinar, to add to your learning and your competencies so that you can serve people even better.
And somebody said, I actually use this in my coaching already. This is absolutely true. These are things that you're already naturally doing. You're just learning new labels for them, and you're learning a codified system for them. But these are all things that you already naturally do. Okay, great. So we're going to go and share the screen again and go into a little more examples of, like, for example, meta model. Like I said, we're just going to do a very quick overview. We're going to do a more in-depth session on these, so just doing quickly. I wanted to give you some idea of how it's used. So in order to recover deletion of information, if somebody says, for example, I have a better idea, you might ask a question of, like, better than what? Because the idea of better kind of deletes the reference experience, right? So this is a way of kind of recovering some of the information. So like distortion, for example. If somebody says, I want happiness, you can actually get more specific by asking, well, what will specifically make you happy, right? Or a good one is like, you don't like me. The question you can ask is, well, how do you know I don't like you, right? Because a lot of times people will misinterpret different body language into their own maps. So for example, like somebody might think I don't like them because I'm crossing my arms as I'm talking to them, whereas I might actually just be cold, right? So these are sort of examples.
And for you as coaches and leaders, it's important that you notice your thrownness to reading minds, because how someone is showing up, and there is something in action, how people show up. But when we start to read minds, then we're falling into a trap where we have less access to actually, working with people in the most meaningful ways, and ourselves as well. Listen, our own generalizations, the things we say, and we start to live as if what we say is the truth.
Exactly.
And we forget, as you know, one of my favorite philosophers and biologists, Alberto Martirani, always say, everything said is said by someone. So notice what's being said and what it's generating, what it's producing, what it's causing.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so challenge assumptions, provide choices.
Yep.
Yeah.
Step back a little bit. So one more example, like for generalization, is if somebody says, "Oh, I never get this right." So this actually kind of shows you how a person is stuck, right? And then you can just simply repeat like "never," and I'm sure the person will be able to think of some example in their lives where they did get it right. Right? So this will just sort of reverse that. Okay. So remember we talked about one of the key factor for success in NLP is knowing your outcome. Well, it turns out when we examined a lot of people who are incredibly successful at achieving their goals, that there's some universal commonalities to them. There were things that they were doing that were universal. There were sort of criteria of how they would create or they would identify their outcomes. And so NLP codified it into kind of 5 different steps. Some people will, some people will have 6 steps or 7 steps, but our 5 steps pretty much captures the essence of it. One is your outcome should be stated in the positive. Why is this important? This is important because our brains doesn't actually process in the negative. So for example, if I told you, like, don't think about a pink elephant. Well, the first thing that you're going to do is think about a pink elephant in order not to think about it, right? So this is why you should say something in the positive terms as possible. And simpler and positive is usually better because remember, our brain, our unconscious mind is actually fairly primitive. So it's incredibly sophisticated, but the way it processes information, the simpler you can make it, the easier it's going to be able to absorb. So you really want to make the statement as if you would say it to a 7 or an 8-year-old in positive terms. So the second thing is you want to be very specific and contextualized. And feel free to jump in anytime. Mm-hmm. So what that means is, remember that meta model example, I want to be happy? Well, that's a very, very general outcome. It's not specific enough and it's not contextualized enough. So that's very hard to achieve. So you might want to say something like, well, I want to be smiling when I see my family members. So that has a certain context to it and it's very specific. So that's actually a lot easier for us to achieve and to work on because we have the context and we have specific actions and behaviors that we can work on, right? Whereas if you say something so general as, I want to be happy, then it's a lot more difficult because you don't know where to start and you don't know where to end. The third is it has to be self-initiated and maintained. So for example, the example that I just gave, like I want to be smiling and joyful when I see my family. Well, can that be self-initiated and maintained? Yes, because I'm the one who's controlling my face. And actually, I know that those of you who haven't studied transformation or NLP yet may disagree, but we can actually control our own emotions and states. So we can definitely initiate and maintain the fact that when we see our family members, we can be smiling and joyful. So the fourth criteria is that it should be achievable and there should be a sensory-based evidence for it. So remember the example of I want to be happy. It's very hard to kind of quantify because you'd have to be very specific about when is that enough, for example. So if I say I want to be rich, like you'd want to be that doesn't have a lot of specification and sensory-based evidence. So if you say, well, I want to have $2 million in my bank account within the next 24 months. Now that's sensory-based because I can go to my bank statement and see that there's $2 million in my account. Is it achievable? Well, I think yes, but depending on your beliefs and your skill levels, you may not think it's achievable, right? So you might want to say something like, well, I want to have $100 in my bank account in the next 24 hours. Is that achievable? I would say almost with everybody, that's true. So that's
On this call.
From this call. I mean, you can go and borrow money from somebody for $100 and put it in your bank account, right?
Yeah.
So there's a lot of ways we can do that. So you have to make sure that it's achievable, and there's sort of sensory-based evidence for this. Fifth is that it should be ecological. Remember, it's going back to that idea of like paying attention to the consequences. What is the cost and what is the consequences for me overall? And what is the cost and benefit for the other people around, right? So one of the interesting things is that I actually used to own a Curves fitness gym with my wife. Actually, I bought it for my ex-wife. And what was really fascinating was that people who signed up by themselves had about 30% chance of achieving their fitness goals. Whereas when somebody signed up with their family members or with a very close friend, that possibility of achieving their fitness goal doubled. I mean, it became almost 60%. And it turns out part of the reason is that it's ecological. When somebody is like wanting to achieve fitness goal, there may be people in your friends who may not actually want that unconsciously. Of course, people would want the best for you, but they know, we tend to know people in a certain way, right? So imagine if you were somebody who was kind of known as a jolly, kind of heavyweight person in your group. And if you were to suddenly change that, unconsciously, other people may have some sort of resistance towards that, right? So there are certain sort of resistance and ecology factors that goes into it. So you'd have to pay attention to ecology to make sure that the well-formed outcomes, that your outcome is well-formed. So once again, this doesn't just come from theoretical, some without evidence. This all comes from actually studying people who are really very good at being successful in achieving their goals. And we found that these were the sort of the 5 things that were very universal to them.
And this is what we also study in terms of, again, the ICF, because our school is credentialed by ICF, International Coaching Federation, and they have 11 competencies. And these 11 competencies are in alignment, congruent with a lot of NLP and also the world of ontology and ecology. And a quick example, one of my clients 2 weeks ago, he had an outcome that he had formed and he was having a hard time with it. So when we got into it, we found out it was the wrong outcome, which you will probably find. And his outcome, his stated outcome, was to be the first at something in his industry. And when he found out that other people were already doing it and he was not the first, he was upset. I mean, not verbally upset, but it diminished what he was up to. So when we got into the conversation was, what did you want by being first? And also, what was the benefit of this for your business? And when he started to look at what the benefit of this would be for his business, being first became secondary.
Mm.
It was no longer primary. And he called me about 3 days later, and he was so thrilled and excited. He said, I'm having this turn out. I started to think about all different kinds of ways that I could have this project work and how I could collaborate with other people. So whatever your outcome is, let your outcome be your feedback to tell you whether it is the outcome that you really want, or is there something else beneath that outcome? And we'll get into that later, but okay.
So actually, if anybody wants to type in a goal or an outcome that they want to try, we can use some real life examples to see if it meets the 5 criteria of well-formed outcome. You'll have this as a homework, by the way, but let's use a couple of live example case.
Little drawings. Who is that?
So the question we're asking is, if anybody wants to type in an outcome or a goal that they have, we can go through it to see if it meets the 5 criteria of a well-formed outcome in order to give you sort of a real life example. Somebody said it sounds like SMART goal. Yes, it's actually very related to the SMART goal. In fact, I think the best combination is to use well-formed outcome and SMART goal in combination. Mm-hmm. That will definitely help you much more achieve your goals much easier. Okay, so we got a couple of examples. Let's take one. Let's see. Do you want to pick one?
No, go ahead. They're coming so fast.
Well, there's one about a job, one about a relationship.
Okay, Emily, and this job came to me without me sending out a resume, so can't say I had a defined outcome goal. Huh.
Okay. Okay, quick question. So, Olivia, do you guys want an example on relationship or on the job? Job, raise your hands. 1, 2, okay. Relationships, raise your hand.
Relationship.
Okay, all right. Relationship wins a little bit by a tiny bit. It was pretty close. So let's do a relationship example. So I want to be in a loving, passionate, joyful, responsible, committed relationship with a man. Okay, great. So let's go through the 5 criteria. So what's criteria number 1? It's stated in the positive, right? So yes, all of that is positive. I want to be in a loving, passionate, joyful, responsible, committed relationship with a man. So that's all very positive. Excellent. So let's go to criteria number 2. Specific and contextualized. Who thinks that's specific and contextualized enough? Thumbs up. Okay. Who think it's not specific and contextualized enough?
Thumbs down.
Thumbs down? Okay. All right, good. Okay. So the nays have it. So I would say it's not specific and contextualized enough. So how can we make it more specific? So one is we can actually put a timeline in it, right? So for example, I want to be in a relationship with a man within 12 months, right? And yeah, so, and also, let's see. So the problem, it's not a problem. This is actually very common, but the thing that's difficult about having words like loving, passionate, joyful, these are all wonderful words, responsible, committed. But these are, when we study meta models, these are what we call nominalizations, which means they're very general words. So like I said, what's responsible, committed, loving, joyful to me can be very different from you. So this is where we actually need to be a lot more specific, right? So it might be something like, I want to be in a monogamous, that's a little bit more specific, right? Or it could be polyamorous, but you'd have to sort of define that more in specific context.
And I just want to say it's 6:31 right now, and we're gonna finish. And
This is the last of it. So okay.
I just want to acknowledge that we're a little over.
Okay.
So stay with us a few more minutes, and we will finish.
So we'll understand if you actually have to get off. This is the last part of it. The next part is this actually, we're going to finish this example and then do, if with your permission, anybody who wants to stay on, will stay on for another 5 minutes for Q&A. But you will get a post-session workout sheet for the worksheet for the well-formed outcome, so you can create your own example and just go through the questions over there. So we're kind of doing this live so that people can see a real live case of it.
And if you have to go, I want you to know that you will be sent instructions to access your membership so that you can listen to the recordings and find your assignments. And also, we'll tell you about CEUs. You can, CEUs through our school are available to you if you're in a credentialing process about your coaching. We have that available to you. And it has to do with resource development with ICF. As I told you before, we are schools credentialed by the International Coaching Federation. And your work here can count towards your certification and the maintenance of your certification.
Perfect. Okay. So anybody who wants to hang around, we'll go over, finish up the example, take a few more minutes with your permission. So with this relationship example, let's examine criteria number 3. Is it self-initiated and maintained? Thumbs up, thumbs down.
I don't know. Just say thumbs down.
Thumbs down. So actually, this is not self-initiated and maintained, because relationship implies that you're with another person, right? So we don't have control over other people. What we can do is we can actually turn this into a self-initiated and maintained statement by saying, I will go on 10 dates in the next 6 months, right? So it's something that you have to initiate and maintain. So that can result in the relationship, right? So what you can do is you can say, well, I will talk to three attractive guys every day for the next 30 days, right? Or I'll talk to one man every day for the next 30 days. So this is something that would be an example of self-initiated and maintained. Achievable with sensory-based evidence, number 4, that's criteria. So once again, this is, it's got, the problem with this is that it's not sensory-based. So you want to say something like, I will be speaking, I will talk to a man every day, or I will go on dates, because that's, you can actually see it, hear it, feel it, smell it. So that would be sensory based. And 5, ecological. So the question you want to ask yourself is, well, how will that affect me overall, and how will that affect others? So sometimes I remember when I first got married, my mother became this woman from hell for some reason. Actually, it wasn't for some reason. She became really, really nasty. Like I started seeing sides of my mother I'd never ever seen before. And I realized the reason is because to her mind, like all of a sudden, like my attention and love was towards another woman. So she feel like she was losing her boy, right? She was losing somebody. She felt like she was losing me. So it was sort of an ecology question. I needed to have addressed that or assured her that that wasn't true, or reframed it or framed it in a way that she felt safe and secure. So this could be something like that, for example. So in the relationship example, it could be that maybe you did meet an amazing man and you're about to get into a relationship, but perhaps your friends or or other family members might be resistant to that for whatever unconscious reasons that they have. Does that make sense? Okay.
And that's why later on we'll ask another question. What impact will that have on the people in your life? Because it will bring about some kind of change. It won't stay the same. If you get married, or even if you get millions of dollars, because they found that quite often when people win the lottery, many of them say they wish they had never won it because their lives are so dramatically different. Mm-hmm. In fact, worse off. But anyway, there's some questions here. You will receive your membership, and you can go into the your membership, and you can review these slides. They'll be in there, and you will get to see all these. And also, in terms of, you will get a well-formed outcome paper, right? Mm-hmm. You're going to get that so that you can actually practice it. Practice forming well-formed outcomes for yourselves and for you can even practice with your clients, those of you that have them. But do them with yourself at first. And you'll begin to notice that certain areas where things are not turning out for you is because you don't have a well-formed outcome.
Right. It is a little tricky because, like I said, a lot of things that we think are well-formed are not. Mm-hmm. And I'm not saying you can't create goals and visions the other way, but we found that people who are very successful, like I said, achieving their goals, tends to use these criteria. So let's take a few minutes to see if there's any comments, questions.
Someone asked, when will the recording be up and where do we get it? Would love to review as soon as possible while it's fresh. So you are entering into a membership relationship with us as well. And you will receive all the membership information, how you log on, how you get into the system, and how you can review that, okay? We will send email, what'd you say, Kyla? Tonight. Can you please post each of the meta models for a few seconds? Each for a question, the meta model.
Actually, I'd like to finish out with the comments and questions. You will, in your slides, there is, the meta models are actually on there, the same slides. And for some reason, if it wasn't included, because I actually don't know what you guys got already, but if it wasn't included, it will be sent again. So you will definitely have it.
Okay. Thank everyone and practice with this. Some of you know each other. And if you ask each other questions, and also next week, we're looking forward to being here with you with more learnings. And what else? We send you information, read through your information. We will also give you recommendations of books to read if you want to study more. This is a wide, broad body of work with a lot to learn. And you're not going to learn it, become masters in 4 courses, 2 hours. But again, it's an opening. And in our school, those of you who are in the school, we have a particular weekend that we do a lot of focus around NLP. And so just know we're continuously learning, because communication, effective communication, is at the heart of our success. And the more we can communicate effectively with first ourselves and then with other people, the more success we'll have in our lives. And that's why we're bringing NLP, because it is a model that has worked. At the heart of NLP, they have observed and modeled people who have great success in their lives. But have success in their lives. And that's what we want for you, and that's what we want for the people that you serve. Mm-hmm. That you all have success in your life, that you can form your outcomes and then accomplish with intention or aim what it is you want to have happen. And if you're an ICF member, Kyla's telling me something to tell you, but we're going to post all of that so that you can know what kind of credits you can get. We look forward to seeing you next week.
Yes.
For those of you who are in the course in November, and we know some of you will be there in Los Angeles in November, we look forward to engaging with you in live, right there, face to face, practicing some of these exercises and having more time to see each other, the kinesthetic part of it, to be right there with you. This guy, like I said, is a master NLP practitioner. He's also a student, great student, teacher, and practitioner of mindfulness, executive coach. He was an executive in his old life, former life. And then the other two people you'll meet, Joyce Christie, Master NLP, Nadine, Master NLP. And we all have different ways of looking at NLP. And that's what we wanted to do with this, to give you this worldview, this map, so that at the end, what we want to ignite in you is this discovery process. What does it mean to be human today? And what can we use? What can we nurture? What can we cultivate so that we can assist people in navigating their lives with more peace, with more dignity, and with more success? So that's why we're here. I thank all of you. Is there a homework assignment? Yes, we'll make sure you get it. And Kyla will be in touch with all of you tonight by email.
So I want to say thank you and appreciate your thank yous. These are very sweet messages that we're getting. So remember the physiology of excellence. We want to open up. So let's everybody all just kind of stretch a little bit. Yeah. And then kind of put your hand on your back. Mm-hmm. Pat yourself for a big thank you. A little hug for Betty.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, guys. I'll see you guys. I'll see you guys.
Tiffany.
So
Okay.
sweet. I'll see you guys in the third session. Take care.
Okay, bye.
Bye.
Oh,